The military homecoming question. The studio lights blazed with their familiar golden warmth. But tonight there was something different in the air, an undercurrent of patriotic anticipation that seemed to pulse beneath the usual game show energy. It was Veterans Day week, and the Family Feud production team had planned something special, an entire episode featuring military families, each representing a different branch of service and a different story of sacrifice and honor. The iconic blue and orange set had been subtly modified for the occasion. Small American flags adorned each family podium, and the usual bright stage lighting had been softened slightly, creating an atmosphere that felt more reverent than purely entertaining. The Family Feud logo still blazed against the backdrop, but tonight it seemed to carry additional weight. A reminder that some games matter more than others. Some victories represent more than points on a scoreboard. Steve Harvey stood at center stage in his most formal suit, a deep navy that seemed to honor the occasion without overshadowing it. His burgundy tie had been replaced with one featuring subtle red, white, and blue stripes, and his usual confident swagger carried an extra measure of respect. He had hosted thousands of episodes, but tonight felt different. Tonight, he wasn't just entertaining families. He was honoring heroes. The studio audience was different too. Scattered throughout the crowd were men and women in dress uniforms, retirees wearing unit patches and service ribbons, family members clutching folded flags and framed portraits of loved ones who had paid the ultimate price. The usual pre-show chatter was more subdued, replaced by a respectful anticipation that acknowledged the gravity of the stories about to be shared. At the left podium stood the Thompson family, representing the United States Army with a dignity that spoke to generations of military service. Leading them was Sarah Thompson, 28 years old, her posture carrying the kind of strength that comes from learning to stand tall when the ground beneath you has been shattered. She wore a simple black dress, her best dress, the one she had worn to too many military ceremonies, too many flag presentations, too many moments when words like honor and sacrifice stopped being abstract concepts and became the brutal reality of loving someone who serves their country. Behind Sarah stood her support system, each member carrying their own relationship to military life. Her mother-in-law, Patricia Thompson, whose silver hair was swept back in a style that spoke to decades of military wife experience. The kind of woman who knew how to pack a household with 2 hours' notice, how to comfort children through daddy's deployment, how to smile through fear at countless farewell ceremonies. Beside her stood Sarah's sister-in-law, Captain Jennifer Thompson, 32, herself a career officer, whose dress blues displayed the ribbons and rank that represented her own service to country. Completing the family was Sarah's father, Master Sergeant retired, Robert Mitchell, whose weathered hands and ramrod posture told the story of a man who had dedicated his life to something larger than himself. But the most important member of the Thompson family wasn't on the stage. 3-year-old Tyler Thompson was back in the hotel room with a sitter, too young to understand why mommy sometimes cried when she looked at pictures, too young to know that the man in the uniform photos wasn't coming home from his business trip, too young to comprehend that the folded flag on the mantel represented the end of everything he had known about family. Across the stage stood the Rodriguez family from San Diego, representing the Navy with the kind of boisterous energy that spoke to a different kind of military experience. Chief Petty Officer Miguel Rodriguez was on active duty, his family still whole, still anticipating reunions rather than mourning losses. They brought laughter and light to balance the weight that the Thompson family carried, representing the joy that military life could bring alongside its inevitable sorrows. The contrast between the two families was profound and necessary. The Rodriguez family embodied military life at its best, service with honor, family with pride, sacrifice with the promise of reward. The Thompson family represented the other side of that equation. The families who give everything and receive only memories in return, who serve their country by loving someone who was willing to die for it. Steve had been briefed on the families beforehand, a departure from his usual preference. to discover their stories organically during the taping. But tonight was different. Tonight required preparation, sensitivity, and the kind of emotional intelligence that distinguished great television from mere entertainment. He knew about Sarah, about the knock on her door 6 months ago, about the chaplain and the casualty assistance officer, who had changed her life with their careful words and their flag-draped dignity. The early rounds had progressed with the kind of respectful competition that honored the occasion, without diminishing its entertainment value. Both families played with honor and good humor, their military training evident in their composure and their grace under pressure. The Rodriguez family played with the confidence of people whose service had been rewarded with safe returns and proud traditions. The Thompson family played with the determined dignity of people who understood that some battles are won by simply continuing to fight. By the fourth round, the score was closer than expected. Thompson family, 70-88, Rodriguez family. The numbers represented more than just points. They represented the collision of different military experiences, different definitions of victory, different relationships with the concepts of honor and sacrifice that defined military life. Steve walked to center stage with his usual theatrical flair. But tonight his energy was tempered by respect for the significance of the moment. The production assistants in the booth had signaled that this question would be crucial, that the momentum of the game hung in the balance. But more than that, Steve could sense that this moment would define not just the outcome of the competition, but the emotional impact of everything that followed. "All right, folks," Steve announced, his voice carrying that perfect blend of authority and warmth that had made him America's favorite host, but tonight modulated with additional reverence. "We're here tonight to honor our military families, the heroes who serve and the families who serve alongside them. This next question," he paused, feeling the weight of the moment. "This next question comes straight from the hearts of the men and women who've worn our nation's uniform." Sarah Thompson stepped forward for the face-off, her movement precise and controlled in the way that military families learn to present themselves during official occasions. She had insisted on being the one to represent her family for this crucial moment, overruling the concerns of her in-laws who worried about the emotional pressure. At 28, she had learned more about strength than most people discover in a lifetime, and this was her moment to honor not just her family but her husband's memory. Steve noticed the composure in Sarah's bearing immediately, but he also sensed the weight she was carrying. In his years of hosting, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people, to sense when someone was holding together through sheer force of will. What he saw in Sarah's face wasn't nervousness or competitive anxiety. This was the controlled emotion of someone who had learned to carry grief with dignity, to honor sacrifice without being consumed by it. "Sarah," Steve said gently, his voice dropping to that paternal tone that had comforted thousands of contestants over the years. "You ready for this one, sweetheart?" Sarah looked up at him with eyes that held depths of experience that seemed impossible for someone so young. "I'm ready, Steve. We're all ready." Steve studied her face for a moment longer, sensing that there were layers to this woman's story that went far beyond what was visible on the surface. "All right then, Sarah. This one's for all our military families out there." He lifted the question card with theatrical precision, but tonight the gesture felt less like entertainment and more like ceremony. "We surveyed 100 military personnel currently serving overseas. Top 8 answers on the board." He paused, building the tension while honoring the gravity of the question. "Name something soldiers dream about while overseas." The question hung in the air with profound significance. It should have generated predictable responses: home-cooked meals, comfortable beds, family gatherings, or simple pleasures that deployment made precious. It was designed to honor the universal longing that defined military service, the sacrifice that made everyday comforts feel like luxuries. But as Sarah stood at the podium, her hand hovering over the buzzer, something shifted in her expression. The careful composure that had carried her through the earlier rounds began to crack, revealing something raw and profound underneath. Her breath caught slightly, And for just a moment, the studio lights seemed to dim as the weight of the question settled into her heart. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. The Rodriguez family exchanged respectful glances, understanding that this moment had transcended competition. The studio audience, filled with military families and veterans, held its collective breath in recognition of something sacred unfolding. Steve's eyebrows raised slightly, that signature expression of gentle curiosity that had become one of his trademarks. But tonight it carried additional weight, additional sensitivity to the emotional territory they were navigating. "Sarah," he said softly, "take your time, sweetheart. What do soldiers dream about?" Sarah looked up at Steve, and for just a moment, her military composure completely shattered. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had been holding something too heavy for too long. "Coming home to their family," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to gather in her eyes. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added words that would change everything. "When they're able to come home at all." The studio fell silent so completely that you could hear the hum of the air conditioning system. The words hung in the air like a prayer, like a confession, like a piece of someone's broken heart offered to strangers. Because sometimes that's the only way to honor what's been lost. This wasn't just a survey answer. This was testimony. This was the voice of military families, who understood that some dreams end, not with fulfillment, but with folded flags and 21-gun salutes. The audience didn't gasp or murmur. They simply absorbed the weight of what had been said, recognizing that they were witnessing something that transcended entertainment and touched the fundamental realities of military service and military sacrifice. Steve Harvey felt something shift in his chest. That familiar tightness that came when someone's story connected directly with his own understanding of loss and honor. He set his question cards down on the nearest podium, with deliberate reverence, the small action sending a clear signal that this moment had become about something much more important than the game. "Sarah," he said softly, taking a step closer to her podium, "can you tell me what you mean by that?" The question was an invitation, a gentle opening of a door that Sarah had been keeping carefully guarded for months. She looked at Steve, really looked at him, and seemed to see past the television persona to the man who understood what it meant to honor sacrifice without being consumed by it. "My husband," Sarah began, her voice gaining strength even as tears began to flow down her cheeks. "Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson. He was deployed to Afghanistan 6 months ago. His second tour. He used to call me every Sunday morning, and he'd always tell me about his dreams, not the sleeping kind, but the plans. The things he wanted to do when he came home." Steve felt his throat tighten. In his decades of entertainment, he had learned to maintain professional distance, to be empathetic without becoming overwhelmed. But something about Sarah's quiet dignity, her refusal to ask for pity even as she shared her pain, cut straight through every defense he had built. "He dreamed about teaching Tyler how to ride a bike," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the tears. "About taking me to that restaurant we went to on our first date. About buying a house with a big backyard where we could have barbecues with his unit when they all got home." The studio had become a cathedral of attention. 300 people, many of them military families themselves, sat in absolute silence, witnessing something they instinctively understood was sacred. The cameras kept rolling, but everyone behind them seemed to have forgotten they were making television. "But Michael's dreams," Sarah's voice caught for just a moment before she found her strength again. "Michael's dreams ended on a Tuesday morning in Kandahar province, when his convoy hit an IED. The chaplain and the casualty assistance officer came to my door that Thursday. They brought his flag and his medals and his final letter to me." The silence that followed was broken by a sound that started small and grew. Someone in the audience was crying. Then another. Soon the gentle sounds of shared grief and recognition filled the studio like a quiet symphony of understanding. "And you know what the hardest part is?" Sarah continued, looking directly at Steve with an intensity that seemed to see straight into his soul. "Tyler still thinks his daddy is coming home. He's 3 years old, and I don't have the words to explain why some dreams don't come true. I don't know how to tell a baby that his hero isn't coming back from his mission. Steve Harvey, who had built a career on knowing exactly what to say in every situation, found himself struggling for words. But sometimes he was learning. The most powerful response wasn't words at all. It was presence. It was witness. It was the simple act of standing with someone in their pain and letting them know they weren't alone in carrying it. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "I need you to know something. And I need your family and everyone in this studio and everyone watching at home to hear this too." The studio fell silent again, waiting. "Your husband didn't just serve his country," Steve said, his words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "He served every one of us. And what you're doing right now, carrying on, raising his son, honoring his memory by continuing to live, that's service too. That's heroism too." The audience began to respond then, not with applause, but with sounds of recognition, soft murmurs of agreement, gentle expressions of shared understanding. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a room full of people connecting over the universal experience of loving someone who was willing to die for something greater than themselves. But Steve wasn't finished. He turned slightly to address the entire studio, his voice rising just enough to carry every corner of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I need everyone here to understand what we just witnessed. This beautiful woman just showed us what real strength looks like. Not the kind you see in movies, not the kind that wins battles, but the everyday kind that gets up every morning and keeps living when your heart is broken." He turned back to Sarah, his expression gentle but determined. "Sarah, I want you to know that Michael's dreams don't have to die with him. Tyler is going to learn to ride that bike. And when he does, his daddy will be watching. You're going to have those barbecues, and Michael's unit brothers will be there to tell Tyler stories about what a hero his father was." The emotion in the studio was overwhelming now. Even the Rodriguez family had completely forgotten they were in a competition. Chief Rodriguez stood with his hand over his heart, visibly moved by Sarah's courage in sharing something so personal and profound. Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. Not a prop, not something prepared for television, but the actual card he carried with his private contact information. "Sarah," he said, placing the card gently in her hands, "this has my personal number on it. Not because you're a contestant, but because you're family now. Gold Star families don't walk alone. You hear me? You and Tyler are not walking alone." Sarah looked down at the card through her tears, then back up at Steve with an expression of such gratitude and surprise that it made everyone watching understand how long she had been carrying her grief without adequate support. But Steve had one more gesture to make, one that would define this moment forever. He looked out at the studio audience, scanning the faces until he found what he was looking for. Military personnel, veterans, families who understood the weight of what had just been shared. "I want everyone in this studio who has ever worn a uniform, who has ever loved someone in uniform, who understands what service means. I want you to stand up right now." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Not just the obvious military families, but people throughout the audience rose to their feet. Veterans from conflicts spanning decades, spouses and children and parents of service members, anyone who had ever understood that freedom isn't free and that some dreams require the ultimate sacrifice. "This is for Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson," Steve announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the studio. "This is for Tyler, who's going to grow up knowing his daddy was a hero. And this is for Sarah, who's going to make sure that hero's legacy lives on." The standing ovation that followed wasn't television applause at all. It was recognition, respect, and the kind of honor that can only be paid by people who understand the true cost of service. It lasted for a full 2 minutes, 2 minutes of silence, broken only by the sounds of shared emotion, shared respect, and shared commitment to ensuring that sacrifice is never forgotten. When the audience finally sat down, Sarah was crying openly. But for the first time in months, They weren't tears of loneliness or despair. They were tears of recognition, of feeling seen and understood, of realizing that love shared multiplies rather than diminishes. Steve walked around to Sarah's side of the podium and gently pulled her into a hug that encompassed not just her grief, but her strength, not just her loss, but her love, not just her yesterday, but her tomorrow. "Michael," he said softly, speaking to the cameras, to the audience, to the millions of people who would eventually see this moment. "Your wife is going to be okay. Your son is going to grow up proud. Your sacrifice mattered. You did good, soldier. You did real good." But Steve wasn't finished honoring Michael's memory. In a gesture that would become legendary in the Family Feud community and beyond, he began removing his Navy suit jacket, the jacket he had chosen specifically to honor the military families being celebrated that night. "Sarah," he said, draping the jacket over her shoulders with the same reverence that might be used to present a flag, "this jacket represents respect. It represents honor. It represents the promise that heroes' families are never forgotten. I want you to keep it, not as a souvenir from a game show, but as a reminder that you and Tyler have a family that extends far beyond blood, that includes everyone who understands what Michael gave for all of us." The jacket was too large for Sarah's small frame, but she wore it like armor, like a medal, like the physical manifestation of a promise that sacrifice would be honored and families would be cared for. The cameras captured every moment in perfect detail, the golden lights reflecting off tears, the navy of the jacket against Sarah's black dress, the sea of standing figures surrounding her with their support and respect. It was television, but it was also something much more important than television. The game resumed eventually, but it was transformed. Both families played not as competitors, but as representatives of all military families, united in their understanding that some things matter more than winning or losing. The final score became irrelevant. Both families were declared winners because some moments transcend the boundaries of games and prizes and television shows. But the moment that would be replayed for years came during the final celebration, as confetti fell and music played. Steve called for quiet one more time. "Before we finish," he announced, "I want to make an announcement that I hope will honor Staff Sergeant Thompson and all our fallen heroes." The studio fell silent. Family Feud is establishing the Michael Thompson Memorial Scholarship Fund for children of fallen service members, Steve declared. "Because heroes' children shouldn't have to worry about paying for college. Because Tyler Thompson is going to grow up knowing that his father's sacrifice opened doors, created opportunities, made dreams possible." The final applause wasn't television applause at all. It was the sound of recognition, of shared commitment, of people understanding that honoring the fallen requires more than words. It requires action, support, and the kind of love that transforms loss into legacy. 6 months later, when the episode aired on Veterans Day, it became more than just the highest-rated Family Feud episode in history. It became a cultural touchstone, a reminder of what television could accomplish when it chose connection over mere entertainment. Sarah received thousands of letters from military families around the world, from Gold Star families who had never spoken about their loss, but found courage in her example. Support groups formed around the episode. Military chaplains used it as a teaching tool for healthy grieving. Wedding planners began incorporating empty chair ceremonies for fallen heroes into military ceremonies. But perhaps most importantly, Tyler Thompson began to understand, in the way that children do, that his father was someone special. The scholarship fund that bore Michael's name grew beyond anything the show's producers had imagined, supported by viewers who understood that the best way to honor sacrifice was to ensure that sacrifice created opportunity for others. Steve Harvey kept his promise in ways that extended far beyond that initial gesture. He attended Tyler's 4th birthday party, where he helped the little boy learn to ride his first bicycle, a moment captured on video and shared with Michael's unit, who were still serving overseas. He called Sarah on difficult dates: Michael's birthday, their wedding anniversary, the anniversary of that Tuesday morning in Kandahar province, to remind her that grief shared is grief diminished. The navy jacket became more than clothing. Sarah wore it to military ceremonies, to parent-teacher conferences when Tyler started school, to moments when she needed to feel connected to something larger than her own strength. And sometimes, when Tyler was sleeping and the house felt too quiet, she would wrap herself in it and remember that love doesn't end with death, it just changes the way it serves. Today, Sarah Thompson works as a casualty assistance officer herself, helping other families navigate the impossible territory of military loss. She understands better than most that service doesn't end with the last breath. It continues in the lives that are changed, the families that are supported, the children who grow up knowing that their parents' sacrifice mattered. Tyler is now 4 years old, still too young to fully understand what his father gave for his country, but old enough to know that he is loved by people he's never met, supported by a community that extends far beyond his immediate family, and heir to a legacy that will open doors he can't yet imagine. The empty chair story became more than television. It became proof that the most powerful connections happen not in spite of loss, but because of love. Not when everything is complete, but when we find the courage to honor what's missing while celebrating what remains. And in television studios around the world, when producers want to understand the difference between entertainment and impact, when they want to remember why stories matter more than ratings, they tell the story of Sarah Thompson, the Gold Star wife, who taught a game show audience that heroes' dreams don't die with them. They live on in the people who love them enough to keep dreaming for them.